They told you that you owe something to everyone, to your parents who gave you life, to your country that provided protection, to society that offered opportunities, to your community that supported your development, to humanity that paved the path you walk. They created an elaborate ledger of debts you never signed, obligations you never agreed to, and payments you must make for the crime of existing. But tonight, we burn that ledger. Tonight, we confront the most liberating truth in human philosophy. Strength is knowing you owe the world nothing. In the grand theater of human control, no mechanism is more effective than the creation of debt. Not financial debt, but psychological, moral, and social debt that transforms free individuals into willing servants who spend their lives repaying obligations they never incurred for benefits they never requested. This debt-based control system operates by convincing you that your very existence creates obligations to others, that your achievements must be shared with those who claim partial ownership of your success, that your autonomy must be constrained by your duties to collectives that existed before you were born and will exist after you die. Tonight, we descend into the philosophical underground to examine how these manufactured obligations serve as invisible chains that bind the strong to the weak, the capable to the incapable, the excellent to the mediocre. We will explore how the concept of social debt functions as a form of psychological slavery that keeps individuals trapped in cycles of guilt, obligation, and service to others' agendas rather than their own development and authentic purposes. Through the ruthless political realism of Niccolò Machiavelli, who understood that princes who accept inherited obligations will be destroyed by those who create their own, through the individuation psychology of Carl Jung, who revealed that authentic selfhood requires severing psychological umbilical cords that keep adults dependent on collective approval, through the beyond morality philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw that genuine strength requires rejecting herd obligations in favor of self-created values, through the existential sovereignty of Jean-Paul Sartre, who recognized that authentic existence requires accepting total responsibility for your choices without inheriting responsibility for others' expectations, and through the Stoic independence of Marcus Aurelius, who learned that inner strength comes from accepting what you can control while refusing to accept responsibility for what you cannot. We will uncover why the rejection of imposed obligations is not selfishness, but the foundation of authentic strength. By the end of this philosophical liberation, you will understand why those who accept universal obligations remain universally weak, why strength requires the courage to disappoint others rather than sacrifice yourself, and why learning to owe the world nothing is not cruelty, but the prerequisite for genuine contribution based on choice rather than compulsion. The question that will determine whether you live as a free individual or die as an obligated servant is this: will you continue accepting debts you never incurred to people who have no legitimate claim on your life, or will you learn that strength means owing nothing except what you choose to owe to those who have earned your voluntary commitment? Niccolò Machiavelli understood something that destroys most leaders before they achieve real power. The prince who accepts inherited obligations, who honors debts incurred by predecessors, who maintains relationships based on historical claims rather than present value, will be consumed by those obligations until nothing remains of their own vision, resources, or capacity for independent action. Machiavelli observed that effective rulers must be willing to repudiate debts that serve others' interests rather than their own, to break agreements that were designed to constrain their power, to ignore claims based on tradition rather than mutual benefit. This is not dishonesty, but strategic intelligence, the recognition that accepting others' definitions of your obligations is accepting others' control over your decisions. The political insight that Machiavelli provides is that strength requires the independence to evaluate every claimed obligation based on whether it serves your strategic objectives, rather than automatically accepting it because others insist you owe compliance, service, or resources based on their interpretation of your moral duties. Consider how this operates in practice. The political leader who accepts every inherited treaty, honors every historical alliance, and maintains every traditional relationship, regardless of whether these commitments serve current interests, will find their options constrained by decisions made by people who are dead for purposes that are obsolete. They become administrators of others' agendas rather than creators of their own. The business leader who accepts every inherited responsibility to employees, customers, and communities regardless of whether these responsibilities serve the business's current strategic needs will find their resources committed to maintaining arrangements that prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. They become custodians of others' expectations rather than architects of new value. The individual who accepts every family obligation, social duty, and cultural expectation regardless of whether these commitments serve their own development will find their life shaped by others' preferences rather than their own choices. They become servants of others' definitions of their proper role rather than creators of their authentic identity. Machiavelli's analysis reveals that this acceptance of inherited obligations serves the interests of those who benefit from your constraint rather than your empowerment. Family members who claim your service based on biological relationship, communities that demand your sacrifice based on geographical accident, institutions that expect your loyalty based on educational or professional history. All of these claims serve to harvest your resources for others' benefit rather than to support your autonomous development. The Machiavellian principle demonstrates that strength requires the psychological independence to say, "I did not agree to this obligation," when others attempt to bind you to commitments you never made, to relationships you never chose, to roles you never accepted. This independence allows you to evaluate every claimed debt based on whether honoring it serves your chosen purposes, rather than automatically accepting it based on others' assertions about your moral duties. This approach transforms every interaction from obligation-based to value-based. Instead of asking, "What do I owe?" you ask, "What do I choose to give?" Instead of accepting, "You must because you should," you respond with, "I will if it serves purposes I support." Instead of being controlled through guilt about ingratitude, you become empowered through clarity about voluntary commitment versus imposed demand. The Machiavellian understanding reveals that those who attempt to control you through obligation claims are themselves weak. They cannot offer sufficient value to earn your voluntary cooperation, and therefore must resort to moral manipulation, guilt induction, and tradition-based coercion to extract the compliance they cannot command through attraction. Recognizing this weakness allows you to respond to obligation-based demands with strategic evaluation rather than automatic compliance, with questions about mutual benefit rather than acceptance of one-sided duty, with commitment to your authentic development rather than submission to others' convenience. Carl Jung's exploration of individuation reveals the psychological mechanisms through which the acceptance of inherited obligations prevents authentic self-development by keeping individuals psychologically dependent on collective approval, external validation, and the comfortable illusion that their worth is determined by how well they serve others rather than how completely they become themselves. Jung understood that the process of becoming an integrated individual necessarily involves what he called the separation from the collective unconscious, the psychological development that allows you to distinguish between your authentic values and the values imposed by family, culture, and society. This separation cannot occur while you remain bound to obligations that were created by collective systems rather than chosen by individual judgment. The person who remains psychologically embedded in collective obligations never develops the internal authority necessary for authentic decision-making because they continue to evaluate choices based on what others expect rather than what they authentically value. They become psychological extensions of collective systems rather than integrated individuals capable of independent thought and action. Jung observed that this collective embeddedness serves the psychological needs of those who prefer to remain unconscious of their own individual responsibility by maintaining systems where personal choices can be avoided through automatic compliance with inherited roles, traditional expectations, and socially defined duties. The individuation process requires what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, the recognition and integration of aspects of personality that have been rejected or suppressed, to maintain acceptance within collective systems. This encounter necessarily involves disappointing others who have benefited from your suppression of authentic desires, needs, and values in service of their comfort and convenience. Jung's analysis reveals that the guilt experienced when rejecting inherited obligations represents not moral failing, but psychological health, the natural result of choosing individual authenticity over collective conformity, personal development over social comfort, genuine selfhood over performed compliance with others' expectations. This guilt serves as a test of your commitment to individuation versus your attachment to collective approval. The person who cannot bear to disappoint others will never develop beyond the level that others find non-threatening, will never explore capabilities that others find uncomfortable, will never pursue purposes that others cannot understand or support. The Jungian path requires accepting what he called the loneliness of the individuated person, the recognition that authentic selfhood necessarily involves separation from those who need you to remain limited to levels they can match, controlled by obligations they can understand, defined by roles they find convenient. This loneliness is not pathological isolation, but the natural result of psychological development that moves beyond the need for external validation toward internal authority. The individuated person can maintain relationships based on mutual choice rather than inherited obligation, voluntary cooperation rather than imposed duty, authentic compatibility rather than traditional expectation. Jung understood that this development process cannot be completed while maintaining obligations that serve others' psychological needs more than your own development. The family member who needs you to remain in familiar roles, the community that needs you to maintain traditional relationships, the institution that needs you to honor historical commitments, all of these represent collective resistance to your individual development that must be overcome through the courage to disappoint rather than the comfort of continued compliance. The psychological insight that Jung provides is that owing nothing to the world means accepting full responsibility for your own development without accepting responsibility for others' emotional responses to that development. You become accountable for becoming who you authentically are, while refusing accountability for others' preferences about who you should remain. This psychological sovereignty creates the internal foundation for all other forms of strength, because it eliminates the cognitive dissonance that comes from trying to serve both authentic self-development and inherited obligations that may conflict with that development. When you owe nothing except what you choose to owe, your choices become expressions of integrated personality, rather than compromises between competing demands. Friedrich Nietzsche approached the rejection of inherited obligations through his analysis of master versus slave morality, revealing that the acceptance of universal duties represents slave morality's attempt to make individual strength serve collective weakness by creating moral frameworks that prevent anyone from rising too far above the common level. Nietzsche observed that slave morality operates by creating universal obligations that make individual excellence appear selfish, while making collective service appear virtuous. This moral inversion serves to prevent the development of genuine strength by making strength itself seem morally questionable, while making weakness seem morally superior. The slave morality framework insists that you owe service to your family, regardless of whether they contribute to your development, loyalty to your country, regardless of whether it serves your values, commitment to your community, regardless of whether it supports your goals, sacrifice for humanity, regardless of whether humanity deserves your sacrifice. These universal obligations serve to drain resources from the strong to support the weak, from the capable to maintain the incapable, from the excellent to subsidize the mediocre. They create systems where individual development must be justified in terms of collective benefit rather than pursued for its own value. Nietzsche's concept of master morality, in contrast, recognizes that genuine strength requires the independence to evaluate every claimed obligation based on whether it serves life enhancement versus life diminishment, excellence versus mediocrity, strength versus weakness. The master creates their own values based on their understanding of what promotes human flourishing rather than accepting values imposed by those who benefit from universal limitation. The Übermensch, in Nietzsche's vision, represents the individual who has transcended slave morality's obligation-based control system by recognizing that they owe nothing except what they choose to owe based on their own evaluation of value, compatibility, and mutual benefit. They serve others when such service enhances life and refuse service when it diminishes life, regardless of moral claims about universal duty. This transcendence requires what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, the systematic examination of every inherited obligation to determine whether it serves strength or weakness, whether it enhances your capabilities or constrains them, whether it supports your authentic development or prevents it. The revaluation process reveals that most inherited obligations serve the interests of those who lack the strength to earn voluntary cooperation and must therefore resort to moral manipulation, tradition-based coercion, and guilt-based control to extract the compliance they cannot command through attraction. Nietzsche understood that this moral manipulation operates through what he called ressentiment, the psychological state where those who cannot create value for themselves attempt to prevent others from creating value by making value creation appear morally questionable, while making value destruction appear morally required. The person trapped in resentment-based morality becomes complicit in their own limitation by accepting obligations that prevent their development, while justifying this acceptance as moral superiority over those who refuse such constraints. They become psychological slaves who police themselves according to moral frameworks designed to prevent anyone from transcending the limitations they have accepted. Breaking free from this slave morality requires what Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of your own fate, including the difficult fate of disappointing others who would prefer you remain bound to obligations that serve their needs rather than your development. This love includes accepting the hatred that others will direct toward you for refusing to remain limited to levels they find comfortable. The Nietzschean path to strength requires recognizing that you owe nothing to those who cannot earn your voluntary commitment through demonstrable value, mutual respect, and genuine compatibility. Your obligations are self-created, based on your chosen values, rather than inherited from systems designed to extract your resources for others' benefit. This self-creation of obligations allows you to commit deeply to people and purposes you choose, while remaining free from commitments imposed by others who have no legitimate claim on your autonomy. You become capable of genuine loyalty to those who earn it, while maintaining independence from those who demand it, based on tradition, biology, or moral manipulation. The practical implications of understanding that strength means owing the world nothing extend into every area where others attempt to control your choices through obligation-based manipulation, guilt induction, or claims based on tradition rather than demonstrated value and mutual benefit. In family relationships, recognizing that you owe nothing means evaluating every family claim based on whether maintaining the relationship serves your authentic development rather than automatically accepting that biological relationships create moral obligations. The family member who contributes to your growth deserves voluntary commitment. The family member who constrains your growth deserves appropriate boundaries regardless of biological connection. This approach eliminates the guilt-based manipulation that dysfunctional families use to extract resources, time, and emotional energy from successful members while providing nothing in return except criticism, limitation, and attempts to maintain everyone at the lowest common denominator. You become free to invest in family relationships that serve mutual development while limiting investment in family relationships that serve only others' need for your constraint. In professional contexts, owing nothing means recognizing that employers, colleagues, and professional communities have no inherent claim on your loyalty, service, or sacrifice beyond what serves your career development and chosen objectives. The job that provides value deserves professional commitment. The job that extracts value without providing adequate compensation deserves strategic disengagement, regardless of appeals to company loyalty or professional obligation. This eliminates the career-limiting beliefs that keep capable people trapped in situations that serve others' needs more than their own development. You become free to pursue opportunities that enhance your capabilities while declining commitments that limit your options, regardless of others' preferences about your professional choices. In social and political contexts, Owing nothing means evaluating every demand for civic duty, social responsibility, and political engagement based on whether compliance serves purposes you choose to support, rather than automatically accepting that membership in society creates obligations to serve collective agendas that may conflict with your values and interests. This creates the independence necessary to support causes you believe in, while refusing to support causes that claim your allegiance based on geographical accident, cultural tradition, or moral pressure, rather than demonstrated alignment with your chosen values and authentic purposes. The development of obligation independence requires what could be called debt audit, the systematic examination of every claimed obligation in your life, to determine whether it represents voluntary commitment based on mutual value or imposed duty based on others' convenience, tradition, or moral manipulation. This audit involves asking specific questions about each claimed obligation. Did I choose this commitment, or was it inherited? Does maintaining this obligation serve my development or constrain it? Is this relationship mutually beneficial or parasitically exploitative? Am I honoring this commitment because I value it, or because I fear the consequences of refusing it? The answers to these questions reveal which obligations deserve continued commitment and which obligations represent forms of psychological slavery that prevent authentic development while serving others' needs for your limitation, service, or resources. Building obligation independence also requires developing what could be called disappointment tolerance, the psychological strength to disappoint others when their expectations conflict with your authentic development, chosen values, or strategic objectives. This tolerance cannot be developed intellectually, but must be built through repeated experience of choosing authenticity over approval. Most importantly, obligation independence requires accepting that others will attempt to reimpose obligations you have rejected through escalating forms of guilt, manipulation, and moral pressure. The family that loses access to your resources will increase emotional manipulation. The employer that loses your unconditional commitment will increase professional pressure. The community that loses your automatic compliance will increase social pressure. These escalation attempts represent tests of your commitment to strength versus your attachment to others' approval. The person who cannot withstand increased pressure will return to obligation-based relationships that serve others' needs more than their own development. The ultimate recognition is that owing the world nothing does not mean caring about nothing, but rather caring about what you choose to care about based on your own evaluation of value, rather than accepting care obligations imposed by others who may have no legitimate claim on your resources, energy, or commitment. This selective caring creates the possibility for genuine relationships based on mutual value rather than inherited obligation, authentic contribution based on chosen purpose rather than imposed duty, and real strength based on internal authority rather than external approval. The person who owes nothing can give everything to those who earn it, while giving nothing to those who merely demand it. They become capable of genuine generosity because their generosity flows from abundance rather than obligation, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than guilt. This transformation from obligation-based to choice-based living eliminates the resentment that comes from serving others at your own expense, while creating the satisfaction that comes from contributing to purposes and people you voluntarily choose to support. The choice that determines whether you live as a free individual or die as an obligated servant is ultimately simple. Will you continue accepting others' definitions of what you owe them, or will you create your own definitions of what you choose to give, based on your evaluation of their contribution to purposes you support? Strength is knowing you owe the world nothing, not because you are cruel or selfish, but because strength requires the independence to evaluate every relationship and commitment based on whether it serves life enhancement rather than automatically accepting it based on tradition, biology, or moral manipulation. You came into this world owing nothing except what you choose to owe. You will leave this world the same way. The obligations others have imposed on you between birth and death serve their interests more than your development. their convenience more than your authentic purpose, their comfort more than your genuine strength. Stop accepting debts you never incurred. Stop honoring commitments you never made. Stop serving obligations that serve others' limitation of your potential rather than support of your development. Start choosing what deserves your commitment based on your evaluation rather than others' expectations. This is not the abandonment of relationship or responsibility. This is their elevation from unconscious obligation to conscious choice, from inherited duty to created value, from imposed burden to voluntary commitment. The world will survive without your obligated service. The question is whether you will thrive with your liberated choice. Own nothing but yourself. Own nothing but your own truth. Choose everything based on your authentic evaluation rather than inherited expectation. Create obligations through voluntary commitment rather than accepting obligations through moral manipulation. Your strength lies not in how much you owe, but in how little you need from others to maintain your authentic identity. Pursue your chosen purposes and create the conditions that serve your development. Strength is knowing you owe the world nothing and discovering that this knowledge frees you to give the world everything you choose to give, based on love rather than obligation, strength rather than guilt, abundance rather than debt. The choice is yours. Continue living as a debtor, paying obligations you never agreed to accept, or begin living as a sovereign individual who creates commitments through choice rather than accepts them through coercion. Your strength awaits your refusal to owe anything except what you choose to owe to those who earn your voluntary commitment through demonstrated value, rather than demand your obligated service through inherited claim. Stop owing. Start choosing. Discover the strength that emerges when you realize you owe the world nothing and therefore can give it everything worth giving. This is not selfishness. This is sovereignty. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. This is not the abandonment of others. This is the foundation for authentic relationship, based on choice rather than obligation. You owe the world nothing. Own this truth. Use it to build the strength that comes from independence rather than obligation, choice rather than duty, voluntary commitment rather than inherited debt. Your strength begins when your obligation ends. End it now.